Hello, good afternoon. My name is Mike Farquhar. I'm a consultant in sleep medicine at Evelina London, in London. Thank you for asking me down to chat about this. This is a version of the induction talk that we have done for our trainees at Evelina London for the last 5 years now. We've done it for every trainee coming through the London School of Paediatrics for the last 4 years now. And as much as possible, it's a message that I'm trying to get out to as many people as we possibly can. What I'm going to try and do over the course of the next hour is tell you why I think thinking about sleep of you is really important in terms of delivering the care that we're here to do, and to give you some practical tips about how to try and tackle that. The handouts have very kindly been distributed at the beginning of the talk, which means you can now all cheat. But the handout basically summarizes a lot of the practical stuff that I'm going to talk about more in the second half, about things that you can try and do to improve things. I, as some of you may know, spend quite a lot of my time trying to get this message to as many people as can possibly listen. Surprisingly enough, social media and Twitter is a very effective way of communicating with people, and quite senior people within the health service. So if you are on social media, do feel free to send any comments or questions to me on Twitter, and I'll try and answer them as best as I can. As I said, there are lots and lots of reasons why I think this is a topic that we need to talk about more within the health service. The reason that I started doing this work 5 or 6 years ago is because of stories like these. These are junior doctors who have crashed and died just trying to get home after working a night shift. These are relatively recent stories. They are by no means the only stories like these. And these were doctors who were working European Working Time Directive compliant rotas. They were working New Deal compliant rotas. They were working night shifts that the Daily Record, a tabloid newspaper, describes as grueling, but they're grueling to the point of view of somebody who reads the Daily Record. To you guys, they are bread and butter. These guys were working the same kind of shifts that you do night in, night out when you work around the clock. We know that stories like these are very much tip of the iceberg. And we've been trying an awful lot over the last few years to make people think about this and listen a little bit more and do a little bit more. When I started, it was quite difficult. I had to really argue. I had to stalk my medical director for about a week before I was allowed to do a version of this talk in our induction for the first time. But we're now at a point where conversations like this are happening on the front page of the BMJ. Now, love or hate the BMJ, the front page of the BMJ is a rough and ready way of getting an idea of what doctors are talking about. So getting to that is a useful indication that we're beginning to reach a bit further with this message. It means that we start to see editorials like this popping up all over the place. This is from the British Medical Journal, and it talks a little bit about part of what the problem of this is. You all know already that sleep is important to every aspect of your physical and mental health. You all know that you could probably be doing a bit more to optimize your sleep and get better sleep, but you're all very able to come up with very good excuses and very good reasons why you don't. Have you all seen stuff like this, editorials like this? Does this sound familiar? Can anyone see the problem with this? So this is an editorial from the BMJ. The language gives it away slightly. This is an editorial from 1895. And one of the difficulties about all of what I'm about to say is that none of it is actually particularly complicated physiology. None of it is groundbreaking new medicine or rocket science research. It is something very basic and very fundamental. Modern life was just as stressful in 1895. They thought their lives were just as anxiety-provoking as the 21st century is for many of us. They didn't have Trump, but they were hiding behind newspapers on the tube instead of behind iPhones. It was felt very similar in many ways. So this is not a new problem, and it is something that has been sitting there for quite a long time, and we're all pretty adept at ignoring it. So, very rough and ready, first question, hands up if you think you usually get enough sleep. Wow, okay, there's usually one. Some very, very, very nervous person there going, maybe. How much sleep should you get, do you know, as adults? Yeah, so sleep varies hugely, and the right amount of sleep for you is something that is individual to you. But the median is probably about 7 to 8 hours for an adult. We know, so I can be pretty confident in asking that question in a room like this, because I know that most adults in this country, let alone most adults working in the health service, are sleep deprived. And they are sleep deprived probably to the tune of about an hour on average per night. Now, for most of us, we are pretty good at rationalizing that hour. You're meant to get 8 hours of sleep, you got 7. You're meant to get 7 hours of sleep, you got 6. It's only an hour. You take an extra espresso, you can manage to do things. You might feel a bit cranky, but you can get on with your day and have a normal kind of life. The difficulty is, if you think about that in a different way, if you were meant to be getting 7 hours of sleep every night of your life, and you're actually getting 6, in the space of a week, you are missing the equivalent of an entire night's sleep. In a talk like this, I can literally talk all day about sleep. You are just going to have to trust me that sleep is the absolute fundamental underpinning of every aspect of your physical and mental health. If you are missing the equivalent of an entire night's sleep every week of your life, it is going to have consequences. And that's before we start to think of you as professionals working in environments like this, where you're asked to work not only long shifts, but long shifts around the clock. So one of the biggest problems I have when trying to persuade people to how to think about this better is that I'm almost certainly talking to an audience who are already sleep deprived as a baseline. If you understand a little bit about sleep, you can start to make a bit more sense of what goes on with it. There's lots of weird and wonderful things about sleep, and actually most of it makes a little bit of sense with a little bit of understanding about the basics of sleep. How many of you have seen a diagram like this before? So a few. The fact that only a few of you indicates that sleep is something that we don't spend very much time teaching about. You spend a third of your lives asleep, but most people complete an undergraduate medical school curriculum in this country with, on average, 10 minutes of teaching about sleep in 5 years. A third of your lives, every aspect of your physical and mental health, 10 minutes of teaching. There's probably a bit of an imbalance there somewhere. The hypnogram, though, is the stage representation of normal sleep through the night. You have different types of sleep, which are down the left-hand side. So you can be awake. You can be in rapid eye movement sleep, which is what we usually call dream sleep. It's when you do most of the narrative dreams that you will be able to recall and have a story-like element to them. Dreaming can actually take place in any sleep stage, but REM is what we usually mean when we refer to dream sleep. Stage 1 and 2 are what we call light sleep. This is the type of sleep that's quite easy to be woken back up from. If there's a noise or something disrupts you, it's quite easy to get up and get going again. Stage 3, by contrast, is what we call deep sleep. This is the stage of sleep where everything slows down, where everything becomes very regular, very rhythmical. It's the physically restorative part of sleep in the main. It's the bit that gives you the energy for the next day. It's when kids literally grow. Growth hormone is secreted during deep sleep. It's when you repair and rejuvenate for the next day. You need all of the bits of sleep to be able to get all of the benefits of sleep. But we can very broadly do that kind of broad brush categorization of what different stages of sleep are for. Deep sleep, very much important in that physical restoration. Dream sleep is very much important in the cognitive aspects of sleep. We know that if I take an audience like this, and you hopefully learn something over the course of the next hour or so, send half of you off to go and rest and relax, and the other half off to go and sleep. Those of you who have slept, when we bring you back and test your understanding, your recall, how well you've integrated the new knowledge that you've learned, those of you who have slept will have retained and understood that knowledge better than those who have just rested and relaxed. It means that if you are in the throes of undergraduate exams or membership exams, that temptation to burn the midnight oil to study is often counterproductive, because without sleep, you're actually not consolidating the learning that you're doing well. So we need all of the bits of sleep to be able to get all of the benefits. We cycle through the stages of sleep in a fairly predictable fashion as we go through the night. And for most adults, approximately every 90 minutes or so, you complete one sleep cycle. It's this stage from wake into light sleep, down to deep sleep, back up to light sleep, and then dream sleep. Constitutes one sleep cycle. And over the course of the night, you will go through a few of those cycles as you progress. As you go through the night, the proportions of the different type of sleep change. So you tend to get most of the deep sleep that you're going to get towards the beginning of the night, most of the REM dream sleep towards the end of the night. One of the other things, by the way, that REM is important for is emotional regulation. If you are relatively REM deprived, which is what most adults who are sleep deprived to the tune of about an hour per night are likely to be, you are much more likely to be short-tempered the next day, much more likely to be irritable. Your ability to detect sarcasm goes down if you are deprived of REM sleep. And I think being able to appreciate sarcasm is probably fairly essential in day-to-day medical practice. One of the other really important things about the hypnogram is it's normal to wake up. And we all wake up briefly at the end of each sleep cycle and settle back into sleep, usually without being aware of it. We think this is probably an evolutionary hangover. It's just checking that your environment's safe and secure and you go back to sleep. But it's why kids wake up frequently in the night. And it's not usually the waking up that's the problem. It's why they don't settle back into sleep. It's why most of you will have had the experience of waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning and you feel, yay, awake, invigorated, refreshed, ready to start your day. You know that your alarm's not going off for another hour, so you manage to get back to sleep. Your alarm goes off an hour later, and how do you feel? Worse, rubbish. Because generally, you've managed to get into a deeper stage of sleep and been woken up from it. Those of you who have the joys of phoning consultants on call at home in the middle of the night will know if your consultant is in deep sleep when you've woken them up, because they will not be able to really understand anything you're saying for the first 5 minutes or so until their brain wakes up to a level that they're able to engage and take part. Over the course of the whole night, your sleep splits like this. You spend about half of the night in light sleep, which is a source of constant dismay to parents in my clinic, about a quarter of the night in deep sleep, and a quarter of the night in dream sleep. So I've touched already on some of the reasons why sleep is important, but you are a room of educated healthcare professionals. You have been doing this for a while. You've been sleeping for quite a long time now in the course of your lives. What is sleep for? Why do you end up feeling like this if you don't get it? What is the function of sleep? So I can pick almost anything that you can think of, and sleep is essential for it. So sleep, as I've already said, is essential for growth, repair, restoring energy, for cognitive processing. It's essential for functioning of your immune system. It's essential for functioning of every aspect of each of your biological systems. Kids with epilepsy, if they're sleep deprived, more likely to have seizures. Kids with diabetes, sleep deprived, more likely to have difficult diabetic control. So sleep is essential to every function that you have. It's like an MOT every night of your life, keeping you in functioning condition. But for most of you, working nights, it's this kind of feeling, this kind of achy, nauseated, lethargic, sluggish kind of feeling that you get when you're sleep deprived and fatigued. That impact of sleep, we are beginning to understand more and more. So where historically lots of us were able to rationalize away the little bit of sleep deprivations, where the research is leading us now is to telling us that even if you are mild to moderately sleep deprived, your risks of lifetime disease like cardiovascular disease, hypertension, stroke, your risk of Alzheimer's disease, your risk of some cancers are all linked to sleep. And the more that we understand about sleep, the more that we realize that optimizing sleep is important for trying to ensure good quality health. If you want to know a bit more about that, this great book, so Matt Walker wrote this book last year. It's been on all the bestseller lists for the last 9 months or so, but it's a great insight into the absolute basics of sleep research and why you should all be thinking about it a bit more. It's perfect bedtime reading. But I need to think about you as people who not only are sleep-deprived adults, I need to think about you as people who are working in long shifts and around the clock to do that. The research on this is even more compelling. So this is a really nice review from the BMJ from a couple of years ago now that looks at all of the evidence for shift workers and sleep deprivation and fatigue. It is a great read. It's a paper that I think you should all read, but more importantly, it's a paper I think every manager in human resources department should read. Every senior manager, everybody who asks people to work around the clock should be reading this kind of literature and being aware of what they're asking people to do to provide care 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It is a great read, but it boils down to this. Shift work is bad for you. If you work shifts, it increases your morbidity and it increases your mortality. And that's just the way it is with shift work. I can't take that away, but I think we should be acknowledging that there is that cost and we should be doing everything we can to mitigate it as much as we possibly can. Next question, hands up if you drive. Keep your hands up if you'd be happy to drive if you'd had a pint of beer, 2 glasses of wine. Everybody, awesome. It's interesting that the older the audience skews, the more hands stay up. Why did you put your hands down? Most people are not drunk if you've had a pint of beer or 2 glasses of wine. So why did you put your hands down? Your reaction time, so absolutely. With even a small amount of alcohol on board, your risk of having an accident increases quite significantly because your reaction time is slowed. And if you're doing 70 miles per hour on a motorway, even a small change in your reaction time can make the difference between safe driving and a critical accident. When I was a kid, the attitude towards driving and drink was basically this. It was basically, as long as you weren't absolutely blutered, technical Scottish word, then you were probably safe to get behind the wheel of a car. 4 pints of beer, that's fine. Don't have the 5th though, but 4 pints of beer, you're fine. We have moved away from that towards an attitude that is pretty much this, which says zero tolerance towards drinking and driving. And that's pretty much what most people expect these days. I am honour bound, by the way, to point out that although this is exactly what the attitude towards drinking was in the 80s, this is not an official government poster, it's from a Mitchell and Webb sketch. But the idea is absolutely right. And the reason that we've done that is for exactly that reason. It is because the risk of accidents goes up when you're even a little bit of alcohol on board. How long do you have to be awake for before your reaction time is the same as if you're at the legal drink-drive limit? Any guesses? So it varies, and it does vary from person to person, but the average is about 16 to 18 hours. By the time you have been functionally awake for 16 to 18 hours, your reaction time is going to be the same as if you're at the legal drink drive limit. It means that your risk of having an accident at that point is the same as if you were at the drink drive limit. But we don't tend to think about driving when tired in the same way as we think about driving with alcohol on board. I am absolutely willing to bet that almost all of you in the room will at some point have got behind the wheel of a car when you've been awake for that length of time. The crucial thing about this as well is that that figure assumes that you have had the right amount of good quality sleep in the preceding nights before that. If you are on morning 4 after 3 night shifts, your cumulative burden of fatigue will have been rising and will be high. You do not sleep normally when you're on night shift. You sleep less and you sleep less well. By the time you get to that 4th morning, your threshold for this type of level of reduction in your reaction time is much lower. Both of those doctors who died at the end of a run of nights. That may just be coincidence, but I think for many people, that is when the risk is becoming cumulatively highest. It means that we absolutely need to think about driving tired in the same way as we think about driving drunk. The physiology is the same. How you get there is different, but the physiology and your risk of your risk of an accident or of a critical outcome is the same. Fatigue is also something you need to be aware about if you drive for other reasons. The law assumes that anyone who gets behind the wheel of a car tired and who has an accident will have known that they were too tired to safely drive when they did so. And that is a point of law that has been proven time and time again in English law and across the rest of the UK. You are not protected. You can't say, do you know what, I was up all night saving lives in recess, that's why I'm tired, let me off. You will not. Whatever happens as a result of you driving tired, you will be held accountable for your actions. Gillian Pick is a nurse in the west of Scotland in Ayr Hospital. A couple of years back now, she was working a very busy night shift respiratory ward, middle of winter, lots of flu around, no ability to stop to take breaks. She worked all the way through the night because it was more important that she looked after her patients than she stopped and took a break for herself. When she finished the shift, she had to go and get her kids to take them to school. In the process of doing that, she crashed her car and crashed into another one. Nobody was hurt, nobody was seriously injured, but both cars were damaged, and she ended up in front of a judge. And the judge told her that she was a hero. She was the type of person that he had nothing but respect for. But he had no option but to find her guilty under the law of dangerous driving, and she was convicted and lost her license. So you are not protected in many ways when you think about fatigue and driving. So that point that fatigue is not a defence in law is a really important one. We know that when we ask a room like this, so hands up if you've ever had a near miss driving home after a night shift. Hands up if you've ever felt unsafe driving home after a night shift. So if anything, that's less than the average, I would say. But we know that if we ask people who work night shifts that kind of question, about half of them will say they have had a near miss or a I almost crashed type of episode. Many more will say that they feel unsafe driving home. This is data taken from a big survey of all of the anaesthetic registrars in the UK last year, which again is a really useful read. It gives a very compelling insight into the impact of fatigue on both a personal and professional level. And anaesthetic registrars, brilliant as they are not unique in this. I think they're a useful group to say, to be able to look at as a whole, but what they're experiencing is probably very similar to what everybody else is experiencing. So we know that crashes and fatal episodes are very much tip of the iceberg, and every single near miss could have been. You are probably going to be safe most of the time driving home, but every time you do so, there is that potential for a dangerous outcome. If you want to see another illustration of that, the BBC Inside Out programme did a 10-minute piece last year where they took a junior doctor and stuck her in a driving simulator after a normal night shift. She gets home safely, but the number of near misses that she makes, the number of split-second decisions where if things could have just been slightly different, she would have crashed and died, are high. And it's a really compelling way. If you ever need to persuade somebody of the importance of thinking about this, that 10-minute video is a very good way of doing so. Okay, one of the other basic bits of sleep physiology that you need to be aware of is your body clock. This is your circadian rhythm, your circadian drive. It's the bit of your brain that is trying to keep you awake in the daytime and asleep at nighttime. In general, it is alert in the day, asleep at nighttime. There's a little bit of an imbalance between the alert drivers in your brain and the sleepy drivers in your brain around about this time of day. So it is normal to feel a little bit sleepy in that post-lunch period. And we see that reflected. Accident numbers go up in that period when we look at them in big numbers. But generally, your body clock is keeping you awake in the daytime, asleep at nighttime. It is one of the single most powerful drives there is in your body, and it is tied into every single aspect of your functioning. And again, this is a piece of medicine that we are just beginning to get to grips with. The Nobel Prize was awarded for circadian physiology research last year. And we're beginning to get to the point where it's not just these kind of top-level things, things like the relationship between the body clock and secretion of hormones and the levels of temperature or blood pressure or heart rate. We're beginning to understand that when we time things like complex cardiac surgery, the outcomes are different for individuals depending on where they are in their own personal circadian cycle. We're going to understand an awful lot more about circadian medicine over the next 20 to 30 years, and it's going to impact every aspect of the care that we deliver. But for the purposes of this kind of talk, we can simplify circadian physiology to that alert in the day, awake at night. This is what we call the two-state model of sleep. C on this diagram is that circadian rhythm, waxing and waning through the course of 24 hours, keeping you alert and awake as you cycle through day and night. S on this diagram is a concept called sleep pressure. You can think of this as being like hunger, but for sleep. So just as when you're hungry, the only thing that really gets rid of hunger is eating. When you are sleepy, when sleep pressure builds up, as it does through the day, the only thing that gets rid of sleep pressure is deep sleep, nothing else. There are a few things you can use to trick and temporarily block that sleep pressure, but the only thing that permanently gets rid of sleep pressure is deep sleep. So for most of us, we start off our day feeling hopefully awake and alert and refreshed. Your circadian drive is high, keeps you going through the day. You slowly build sleep pressure through the day. And although the circadian pressure is starting to drop off, you are usually able to maintain wakefulness up until around about 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, by which point the circadian drive is beginning its deep dive down towards its nadir. And the gap between the high sleep pressure and the circadian drive dropping off is what gives us the ability to fall off to sleep. The sleep pressure is removed fairly quickly over the course of the night because deep sleep predominates towards the beginning of the night and gets rid of that sleep pressure, but we maintain sleep due to the effect of the circadian drive keeping us there. It's only as the circadian drive starts to tilt upwards towards the end of the sleep period that most of us feel ready to start our day. So for a healthy person, this is what sleep should look like: a fairly regular waxing and waning rhythmical interaction between sleep pressure and the circadian drive. This is somebody who rather heroically is going to attempt to do a night shift without making any adjustment to their sleep whatsoever. So on the left-hand side, you've got a normal day and night. They've slept, they've woken up. They're going to come and try and do their night shift here. By the time they come to start their night shift, about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, they still feel all right. The sleep pressure is high, but they still have enough of a boost from the circadian system that they're not particularly feeling tired yet. As they go through their night shift, though, the circadian drive will start to dip from 10, 11 o'clock onwards. By the time you hit midnight, if you've not had any sleep since that morning, you begin to feel the pressure of that sleep. You begin to feel yourself slowing down, becoming sluggish, thinking more slowly, probably starting to feel the aches and pains and the nausea that are the joys of working at night. And by the time you get to 3, 4 o'clock in the night, you feel absolutely awful, which is the worst possible time in relation to working night shifts. That low point from the circadian drive hits and coincides with the high sleep pressure that's built up. After that point, though, things seem to get a little bit better. Come 6 o'clock in the morning, you start to feel a little bit better. You get a bit of a second wind, and some of it is psychological. For pediatricians, it's the knowledge that we can hand over the crash page and somebody else is going to have to go and deal with the 3-month premature twins that are expected any minute. It's the presence of toast appearing on the wards, the idea that you're going to get to go home. So there's a psychological boost to the end of the night shift that I think is very real. But there's also a physiological boost. Even though your sleep pressure is high and is continuing to rise, your circadian drive is still thinking it's normal wake time, normal morning time. And you get that alerting signal coming through. So you get a false dawn, if you like. You feel better. You feel more alert. You feel more refreshed than you did at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. But it's false. If we objectively test you at that point, you will be just as impaired in terms of things like reaction times or other cognitive measures than you were before. So it gives you a false sense of reassurance. If you stay awake, you can often ride that second wind through the rest of the morning. You will find that things like impulse control and decision making are significantly affected, which is why post-night spending sprees are not uncommon. I once bought 2 PlayStations in the same morning after an intensive care night shift, and I still don't know why, but anyway. What you then tend to find, though, is once you get beyond midday, if you've not had sleep, you just get to a point where you crash out. You cannot go for long periods of time without sleep. Sleep deprivation is actually one of the most powerful forms of torture that the CIA don't admit to doing in Guantanamo Bay. You cannot survive without sleep for any length of time. So if you have not slept, you will be forced into sleep. You never regain all of the sleep that you've lost, but you will sleep slightly longer than normal. And what your brain does preferentially is usually to try and increase the proportion of deep sleep that you get to try and get yourself recharged and regenerated. So we need to think a little bit. Does that all sound familiar, by the way? Does that all match with your experience of working night shifts? Okay, so we need to think a little bit about the circadian drive as well, particularly when we're thinking about people who are working at night. So, hands up if you've ever traveled far enough away to be jet lagged. How did jet lag feel? Pretty rubbish for most people. Some people are lucky and don't get jet lagged, but most people get jet lagged when you travel the world. The reason for that, the reason we get jet lagged is the further away you travel from base, the more misaligned your body clock becomes with the world. If your body clock is telling you it's midday and the rest of the world is telling you it's midnight, then you are going to feel sleepy when you should feel awake. You're going to feel awake when you should feel sleepy. And if you're trying to function at a time that your brain and body tells you you should be asleep, then you feel sluggish and slow and miserable and emotionally fragile and achy and nauseous and all the joys that come with jet lag. It's pretty much what you feel like when you're working a night shift. And that is the absolute fundamental point. We would not expect people to get off a plane at Heathrow or Gatwick and wander down to Eastbourne and run the intensive care unit or the emergency resus. We would give them a few days to adjust and acclimatise and sort out their jet lag. When we ask people to work a night shift, we are physiologically asking them to do exactly the same thing. And whilst I don't think anyone would particularly want a run-in and a run-out of night shift of a few days and just prolong what's already a less than joyous experience for most people, we should be acknowledging that asking people to work at 3 o'clock in the morning is physiologically unnatural. You are not evolved to do anything other than sleep at 3 o'clock in the morning. And if you are being asked to perform complex activities, as you are when we ask you to work around the clock in a hospital, your ability to do that is not going to be as good as if you're working in tune with your body clock. It's a really simple, really basic piece of physiology, and yet hospitals have been phenomenally good at ignoring it for a very long time. We can demonstrate the impact of that in multiple ways. This is a study done by a medical student who's now a house officer, not too far from here along the coast in Southampton, in the paediatric intensive care unit. She took a group of registrars at the beginning of a night shift and the end of a night shift, gave them a really simple risk experiment. You press the button, the more you press the button, the bigger the balloon gets. The bigger the balloon gets, the more money you get, but the bigger the balloon gets, the more likely it is to pop. So they do the experiment at the beginning of the shift, they do it at the end of the shift. What do you think changes at the end of the shift in terms of the balloons? More balloons pop, absolutely. Fatigue makes you take more risks. We know that when people are sleep deprived and fatigued, their sense of judgment, their sense of ability to analyse a situation and process risk is impaired. What doesn't change about those individual registrars? So they are just as confident making the riskier decisions at the end of the night shift as they were making the safer decisions at the beginning of the night shift. Because one of the other things that becomes impaired when you're sleep deprived is that sense of ability to assess your own function. Your insight into your own function becomes impaired, and particularly when combined with that circadian false dawn effect, you are often thinking you are better than you actually are in terms of what you're doing. It's why people, even when they've had people like me tell them it's not safe to drive, it's why they still say, oh, but I feel fine, I'll be okay. So that sense of judgment is impaired. It means that we have to think about this in terms of the impact on patient care. Half an hour before they did this repeat experiment, these were the people that were going to get called to resus for the fitting child at 7:30 in the morning. The decisions that they make in terms of patient care are going to be affected by their ability to function when acting like this. Until the Baba Garba original ruling, the GMC were beginning to look on this in a relatively favourable light, and were making that connection between sleep deprivation and fatigue and doctors' ability to provide safe care to their patients. The Baba Garba ruling kind of knocked that for six slightly by saying that an individual was being held responsible for both her individual failings, such as they may or may not have been, but also the systemic failings. And I don't think, even with the overruling of that judgment, I don't think we've quite got to the point of working out where the GMC sit on this. But from my point of view, this is a systemic problem that can be exacerbated by individual issues, but we must address the systemic issues before we're going to be able to make any kind of real headway into it. We know from data from the GMC survey that if we ask people if they feel tired in the daytime, that about 20% of people will say that they feel tired working in the daytime. And that's before we even think about working night shifts. 20% of all doctors filling in the junior doctor survey, and that's both junior doctors but also the consultants who train them, say they feel tired such that it affects their ability to function in the daytime already. The last little bit, I don't know about you, but we are just beginning to ramp up our flu campaign in Guy's and St Thomas's. So you're all about to get the annual deluge of you must be vaccinated, it's part of our winter planning, you must get this done to look after our patients. The immune system is something else that sleep is fundamental for. If you are a little bit sleep deprived and you're exposed to the flu virus or the cold virus, you are 3 times more likely to be symptomatic of it than somebody who's had the right amount of sleep. If you get the flu vaccination on a day when you are sleep deprived, at day 10, your vaccine response will be 50% that of somebody who had the right amount of sleep on the day that they had their vaccine. So if you are about to be thinking about winter preparations and the flu vaccine, please remember that your sleep is actually a fundamental part of that as well. This all boils down to that really simple point. We know this, you all know that. Tired doctors make mistakes. And while some of this can be addressed on an individual level, we have to be thinking about the systemic factors and adjusting those as much as we possibly can. There are lots of things that I think individuals and trusts can and should be doing to address this, but fundamentally it boils down to this. We tend to forget that the reason that breaks exist are not because they're nice for us, they are, but actually without them, you are not able to provide safe, efficient and effective care to your patients. If you have been awake and functioning in a shift for 12 hours without a break, then you're not able to function at your best. Drivers are told to stop and take a break after every 2 hours of driving because their function drops off after that. These signs are up and down the A9, so the complete other end of the country from here, where I'm from. Beautiful road, but if you drive it a lot, it gets really boring. And the drivers used to crash and were actually causing harm in doing so because they were tired and fatigued. So they stuck these signs up to remind them. It's a really basic, fundamental point. We see it in other industries. You don't want tired airline pilots. The analogy between medicine and airline industry, by the way, is always a little bit fraught. But for this purpose, this is a useful way to think about it. The modern airliners like these have special spaces that sit up above the passenger cabin where the crew can go during the course of a 12 to 13 hour leg of a flight to make sure that they get rest and breaks. They are absolutely rigorous in getting those rest and breaks, and they will often sleep during those rest and breaks. The airlines are not doing this because they're being particularly nice to their crew. They're doing that because they think it's the absolute minimum that they can get away with in terms of safety to make sure that plane has the best chance of getting from A to B without there being an incident. We do not think in anywhere near the same way about your guys' health and fatigue when working these types of comparable shifts in the health service. Are any of you related to pilots? So pilots are lovely people, but they often get very upset when I point out to them that for them, a 12 to 13 hour shift is often literally on autopilot. And yet they have these kind of things put in to make sure that they're functioning at their best. You are all making decisions through the course of a 12 to 13 hour shift constantly. The cognitive demand of being in a job in the NHS that demands 24-hour care is much higher than a pilot, but we don't put anywhere near this degree of protection in place. You may have seen they shut the runway at Gatwick a few months back. Meant to be three air traffic controllers on duty. 2 of them were sick. 1 of them turned up. If you're an air traffic controller, you have to get a mandatory 30-minute break after every 2 hours of work because they just say it's not possible to maintain that degree of concentration and focus for any longer than that without your ability dropping off to the extent that it will impair your function. So faced with that decision, what do? They could either make one guy work the whole thing, or they could shut the runway. And that's what they did. And there was lots of very annoyed people whose flights were redirected or cancelled and all the rest of it. You know, this is a terrible thing. Why is this happening? Make him work. But they said this is the only safe thing to do. We cannot close the runways in a hospital. But that makes it even more important that if we can't close the runways, we have to be thinking about all the things that we can do to try and make this better as much as we possibly can. So the argument that we've been trying to make is that for all of these types of reasons, and many more, we think that we should be stopping and looking at this as a problem and trying to think about ways that we can make it better. One of our big challenges is that we spend quite a lot of time telling people like you guys that you are amazing, that you are doing amazing things under amazing pressures and how brilliant you all are, and we love you all for it, and that's brilliant. We tell you that if you manage to get to work in the middle of a snowstorm, that you're a superhero. We tell you that if you've managed to keep going despite the fact that the other 3 people on the shift didn't turn up, that you're amazing, you're a superhero. And it's all true. You are amazing people doing amazing things. But the difficulty is every time we use language like that, it creates the expectation that that is what we expect of you. If you hold yourselves to those standards, it becomes impossible to keep them up. You're not superhuman, I'm afraid, and your physiology is absolutely boringly normal, and your physiology will fail just the same way as everybody else's does if you don't stop and look after yourself. But this constant referencing that we have within the NHS of you're all superhuman, you're all superheroes, you're all amazing, is a really big problem with this. GSTT used to give our nurses a bag that said, what's your superpower? Mine's I'm a GSTT nurse. And after a bit of a conversation with our chief nurse, we got rid of them because it's the wrong message to be sending. And that's a really difficult thing to do. We come into this all the time with our registrars. We've worked really hard with our registrars to say you should take rest and breaks, and they still have this mentality. It's really difficult to crack it. So, the last 20 minutes or so, what can you do? What can we do? There are things that you can do as individuals. And what you're aiming for, more than anything, is to try and make sure that you're getting as much good quality sleep most of the time as you can. And actually, that is the key. If you were going to work 24-hour shift, or around the clock, rather, work long shifts, work things that are going to be difficult to tolerate, the most important thing that you can do to try and improve your ability to do that is to concentrate on your core sleep, what your sleep is like every night of your life, not the nights you're doing nights, but all of the time. And the better that core sleep is, the more likely you are to be able to tolerate those extra changes, extra pressures. I keep a box of tissues in my clinic because families, when they come to see me, usually burst into tears when they realise that I don't have any magic and I'm not suddenly going to transform their non-sleeping children into perfectly sleeping children. And it's just the same for you. There is no magic. There is nothing that I can stand up here and say, if you just do X, Y, and Z, your sleep will be perfect. So there are no magic solutions. And on top of that, sleep is a very individual thing. So although lots of the general principles that I'm about to talk to apply to most people, you need to know a little bit about what your sleep is and how you can apply these types of tips, this advice to you to make it work best for you. So you're all, as I said, educated healthcare professionals. The idea is you take the information and make it work for you rather than me giving you a prescription that says this is what you must do. However, there are some basic core things that I think you can think about. How you sleep depends on 3 key things. The first is your environment. And actually really simple things can make a big difference. How often are you meant to change your mattress, do you know? Louder? Yeah, every 5 to 8 years. I think the mattress companies are saying 5 years, but they have a slightly vested interest. But how many of you have changed your mattress within the last 5 years? So something as simple as that can make a difference. If you don't have a comfortable bed, you will not sleep well. I've genuinely had kids come through my clinic where they've come back for the first follow-up and the parents have said, you know what, we bought him a new bed, now he sleeps like an angel, it's perfect, bye, we don't need you anymore. So think about simple things like your bed and get them right. To sleep well, you need to sleep in as dark an environment as possible. Light is one of the strongest factors that affect sleep quality that we know. And particularly if you are working around the clock, it's really important to be able to make your bedroom space as dark as possible. That means it's worth investing in things like blackout blinds and blackout curtains. At our induction last week, we gave all our new junior doctors an eye mask, not because we thought it would magically transform their sleep, but partly to reinforce that we are trying to encourage them to think about this. But there are ways that you can do to try and optimize light exposure, particularly if you're trying to sleep in the daytime. Temperature is becoming an annual struggle, certainly in central London, where the temperatures in bedrooms tend to sit above 30 degrees for the core of the summer for the last few years. You really need to be in a bedroom that's around about 18 to 20 degrees to get good quality sleep. If your bedroom is too hot, you will not sleep well. My secretary's phone goes off the hook every summer with all the parents ringing to say that my patients aren't sleeping, and generally it's because of environmental changes more than anything else. Improving bedroom temperature is tricky. It's lovely when you have access to things like central air conditioning, but most of us don't. But there are tricks that you can do to try and encourage your bedroom environment to be cooler that make a difference. Sound is the other one. Along with the eye masks, we gave our new junior doctors earplugs, because again, even small sounds can make big differences to sleep. We published in the Christmas BMJ this year demonstrating the impact of Big Ben's bongs on the quality of sleep in children in our sleep lab, which is right by the Thames. And every time Big Ben chimes or bongs, we can see the disruption to the quality of sleep in the children in our lab. Environmental noise has a much bigger impact on your sleep than you may be aware of. So it's worth looking at things like that and investing in things like earplugs, using white noise. There are increasingly sophisticated technological gadgets coming on the market that claim to be able to completely reduce the impact of environmental noise. But particularly if you are going to be sleeping in the daytime, getting these kind of basics right is really important. As I said, we've just started, as well as getting this kind of teaching from me, we've started giving all of our junior doctors eye masks and earplugs when they start. So this was our crew modelling them last week when they started. There are things you can do in the daytime that help to improve the quality of sleep that you get. As I said, light is one of the single strongest factors that modulates wake and sleep. And bright light exposure in the daytime is one of the single most powerful ways there is to keep your body clock aligned as well as possible most of the time. The earlier in the day you get bright light exposure, the better. And that helps to keep your body clock in sync. If you get bright light exposure at the beginning of the day, it makes it more likely that you'll be able to fall asleep at the right kind of time towards the end of the day. This can be challenging in hospitals. There's some lovely research from old folks' homes where they're all sitting in dingy lights that's a bit like this, and they're all sitting shuffled and doing nothing. And then they come in and they change the lights. That's all they do, is they put high intensity LED lights in. And within a week, the mood has improved, the activity has improved, they're all up, they're doing things that changes the entire feel of a place when the light level is right. So as much bright light exposure in the daytime is good for you, as is all the boring simple doctor stuff. As much exercise as you can get in the daytime is good for you. The more exercise you get in the daytime, the better quality sleep you are likely to get. And there's good evidence that tells us that for many adults with sleep problems, exercise is a more effective intervention for improving sleep than sleeping tablets are. Sleeping tablets are rarely the answer to sleep problems, by the way. Exercise, so most people, exercise is best done through the day rather than close towards the end of the day. For most of us, if we exercise too close to the end of the day, it just gets ourselves all G'd up. The exception to that is sex. So sex is good for sleep as long as you both orgasm. So if everybody's happy at the end of the day, then sleep quality improves. So simple, straightforward advice for improving sleep. Other things, you need to be able to switch your brain off at the end of the day. There's no simple prescription for that either. Everybody has their own way of relaxing and winding down. For some people, mindfulness is just not me at all. I'm not touching that, doesn't work for me. For other people, it's a really positive way to be able to help them to relax and wind down at the end of the day. There are lots of different things that people can do to rest and relax and wind down. But if you go to sleep churning over the decisions that you've made in the daytime, still processing all of the things that you've been dealing with in the daytime, even if you do get to sleep, your sleep quality is not going to be good. You need to have some way of relaxing and winding down and switching off. If you're into the mindfulness kind of stuff, Headspace is a brilliant app for doing that for those who are able to engage with it. There are things that are bad for sleep. Coffee is something that temporarily blocks the impact of sleep pressure, but it's only temporary. It wears off again. And if you overload on coffee, it's going to affect the quality of sleep that you get through the day. The half-life of coffee is about 6 hours, which means if you take it through the course of a day, again, you are likely to still be able to get to sleep, particularly if you're sleep deprived, but the quality of that sleep is going to be impaired. Coffee lurks in all sorts of places. So the obvious ones, so tea and coffee, obviously have caffeine in them. Decaffeinated coffee still has caffeine in, 5 milligrams compared to 45 milligrams in an espresso. If you happen to be sensitive to caffeine, decaffeinated coffee is still enough to screw up your sleep. It lurks in all the fizzy drinks, often in quite significant quantities. A can of Pepsi Max is the equivalent of an espresso. So there's quite a lot of caffeine in some of these. The energy drinks have more. A sometimes unseen culprit is chocolate. I had a teenage girl in my clinic a few months back who had very disrupted nighttime sleep. And eventually we cured it by stopping her eating the bar of Toblerone before she went to bed every night that she was eating. And that was what was driving her sleep disruption. So even chocolate can be, unfortunately, a source of issues. Analgesics is the other one. So Anadin Extra has as much caffeine as an espresso in it. So if you're popping that for an end-of-day stress headache, it's going to affect the quality of sleep that you get. However, the big problem is that most of you are pretty adept at prioritizing other things other than sleep. And the kind of things that people do and say it's more important that I do these things rather than go to bed at the right time, spending time with your family, with your partner, doing work is probably the only negative thing on this list. Watching TV, friends, exercise, all sound like really positive things to be doing. But the difficulty is that if you are taking time away from sleep to do these things, then you're missing out on all the benefits of sleep. One of the really key ones on that list for me is watching television. Hands up if you watch TV before you go to sleep. So this is increasingly becoming a problem. So the CEO of Netflix was interviewed last year and was asked as part of the interview, who's your number one competitor? Who's your biggest problem? Who do you want to see removed from the field? And he said sleep. They were expecting him to say Amazon Prime or something like that. This is how the CEO of Netflix thinks about your sleep. He is monetizing your sleep because he knows you're all busy, and he knows that the only way that you're going to keep paying him money is if you have time to watch his product. And the only time that most of you have to watch his product is time that you should be spending sleeping. So everything that they do, their entire business model is predicated on stealing sleep time from you, which is a slightly scary prospect. And my number one enemy is now the CEO of Netflix. But that's how he makes money. It means that this is a problem. Hands up if this is you. Yeah, so I suspect many of you are probably being slightly shy about that. For many people, this is the end of the day. You're on electronic devices before you go to sleep. It means that the last thing you're getting at the end of the day is a bright light source right next to your brain, right next to your eye, rather. It has a lot of effects on sleep. It suppresses melatonin, which is the natural hormone that your body clock triggers the release of at the end of the day to tell you it's time to go to sleep. If you get lots of bright light exposure at the end of the day, your brain thinks it's not bedtime yet, so it doesn't produce melatonin. On top of that, it has a slightly more subtle effect. If you were meant to go to sleep at 10 o'clock, but you're up until 3 o'clock in the morning watching the latest season of Iron Fist or whatever, if you do that 3 or 4 nights in a row, if you're getting light exposure later than you should do, your brain says, all right, okay, it's a lot lighter later on in the day than I thought it should be. We must have moved. Your brain thinks that you've shifted in space when you affect it with light in that way. It will rewire your brain to function on New York time because it thinks that's what you've done. Exactly the same way that you rewire when you're jet lagged and it corrects, that's what you're doing to your brain. And it means on night 4, when you finish binge watching the season, you're like, oh right, okay, I need to catch up on my sleep. I'm going to go to sleep at 10 o'clock. And your brain says, yeah, you might think you are, but it's 5 o'clock as far as I'm concerned, and you don't go to sleep at 5 o'clock, so you're just going to have to sit here and feel awake. And by the way, are you going to go back on your TV again, which is what most people do. So that subtle effect is really important. The phone companies try to say, oh, well, change the amount of light that they give off, we'll change the frequencies, we'll make it better. We thought this was worth trying, but the evidence says, nah, it doesn't make any difference. It's the intensity of the screen itself rather than the frequency that has most of the effect. So you're kidding yourself if you stick night shift on and thinking it's taking away the impact on your sleep. The last effect, though, is the psychology, and this is what the Netflix guy is depending on. He knows, this is why it binge watches. It's why it doesn't finish one episode before the next one starts, because they're relying on your psychology to keep you going through. I look after a lot of kids with high-functioning autism, and they talk to me about the YouTube black hole or the Wikipedia black hole, where they start off watching one video or reading one article, and then they just keep pressing the links. And by 5 o'clock in the morning, they have an in-depth knowledge of the Plantagenet kings and queens of England going back to the year dot. but it's 3 o'clock in the morning and they haven't gone to sleep yet. So it can have a really big impact in thinking about it. So thinking about your relationship with electronic devices, I'm afraid an hour before bed is what we advise. Get them out of your bedrooms, don't be on them before bed. They have a massive impact on sleep and sleep quality. So think about your bedroom environment, get lots of daytime light, get lots of exercise, basically do lots of the things that you enjoy doing less more, and do less of the things that you do enjoy doing. So being on your devices, drinking coffee or other drugs or stimulants, try and do those less if you're thinking about good quality sleep. If you're working through the night, you then have to build on that. There's not a lot you can do to really prepare immediately for a night shift other than make sure that you've got as much good quality sleep as possible in the run-up. For most people, try and harness that afternoon lull the day before the afternoon before you start your night shifts. And if you can, bank a little extra sleep. Have a nap in the afternoon before you have to come in the evening. But otherwise, just try and come in with as much good quality sleep in the run-up as you possibly can. Through the night, I'm going to skip through these slides because this is summarized in the article. Through the night, there are things that you can do to try and improve how you work. From my point of view, one of the key recommendations, so first of all, you must get your breaks. You are even more vulnerable if you're working a 12-hour night shift without a break than if you're working a day shift without a break. Get your breaks absolutely religiously. But if you can take a short power nap during a nighttime break, you are likely to mitigate some of the impact of fatigue and sleep deprivation. These are short 15-minute sleeps. No longer, because if you sleep longer than that, you're likely to get into deep sleep, which if you're then woken up from suddenly, you're likely to be slow and sluggish and take a while to get going. But for most of us, 10 to 15 minutes of sleep, you'll still be in the lighter stages of sleep and you can be woken up relatively quickly, but it still gives you some benefit. Caffeine takes about 15 minutes to be metabolized, so although, as the cartoon suggests, overloading on caffeine all the way through the night has its problems, if you do use caffeine, take your last shot of caffeine just before you have a power nap. It takes about 15 minutes to kick in. By the time you wake up from the power nap, you get the double benefit of both the caffeine and the sleep. There are more hints and tips which are in the article. If you have to get home, the most important thing is if you're too tired to drive, don't. If you are working the junior doctor contract, you are legally protected by that. The second you say, I'm too tired to get home, your trust is obliged to either get you home safely or provide you a proper bed and somewhere to sleep until you are safe to drive home. If you are getting home, simple tricks, stick on a pair of sunglasses, try and block brilliantly beautiful daylight today, but if you finish a night shift and come out into a daylight today, all that light is going to convince your brain that you're meant to be awake, and you're trying to persuade your brain that you're going to go home to go to sleep. So dark glasses helps to mitigate that a little bit. It also reminds you that you shouldn't be on your phones. If you can use public transport, do so. That is always more challenging, particularly where I'm assuming that Eastbourne is part of a network, particularly for doctors, where many people are rotated here for short periods or relatively short periods of time. Is that true or not true? Yeah. So it becomes more difficult when rotations come into play. When you finish your night shifts, you have to get back to normal. And one of the things about most of our current rota patterns is that for many of you, you'll be working shift patterns where you finish nights at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, and we expect you back at work on 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning to start back again. 48 hours is the absolute minimum time that your body can take to rewire and get back into a day shift mode, which means if you have to do that, you're going to have to be bloody good at doing it. So you need to think about ways to try and make sure that you can do that as well as possible. What I recommend for most people, and again, this is something where there's a lot of individual variation, but for most people, what I would recommend is go home as quickly as you can after a night shift, get a nap that's a bit longer than a power nap. You're aiming for about 1 sleep cycle, so about 1.5 to 2 hours of sleep. Set your alarm to wake you up before midday, preferably, and then get up, get out and do active things, exercise, get into bright light, do as many of your normal things as you possibly can. Get yourself back to bed as close to your normal bedtime that night as you can. And then the absolute killer, I'm afraid, is you need to get up at your normal wake-up time on the Tuesday and do normal things in the day on the Tuesday, because you need to get going back into your normal bedtime routine by Tuesday night. If you succumb to the temptation of the long lie on the Monday or the Tuesday, all you do is delay that resetting. If you lie in till 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Tuesday, there's no way, almost certainly, you're going to go to sleep in a good way at 10 o'clock that night. You're going to be awake later, which means you're then more sleep deprived when you come in the Wednesday morning. But different people have different strategies. Again, the article covers a few more of those in that. You've all got this, so this kind of summarizes some of those practical, pragmatic hints. I've still got 5 minutes, I think. I'm going to have a drink, sorry, excuse me. So, The other side of this is that we've been doing a lot of work about trying to improve this over the last few years. We look at how trusts do these kind of things. From my point of view, that recommendation for the power nap is a really useful one, because actually whether trusts support power naps is a really sensitive way to find out how well they understand circadian physiology. And we know, because we've been out and asked all of the London School of Paediatric trainees from hospitals all around our deanery what they think, that we get lots of comments like these back. If I catch you sleeping on night shift, you're in trouble. I'll photograph you. You'll be docked pay, whatever. You're not allowed to. There's this idea, there's a culture of fear about sleep at night. A positive trust is supporting sleep in the right way. And I'm not necessarily suggesting we should be paying people to be asleep for the entire night shift, but power naps on night shift are a way to mitigate the risks to both individuals and our patients. And if trusts don't support them, they don't understand circadian physiology. Basic as that. We've put together lots of resources in various different places. So this is the one on the Guy's website. We've done lots of work with various people. This ties in an awful lot with concepts of burnout and resilience. That article is resilience training. And I think resilience is a concept that people often get very rightly upset with, because we too often, I think, hear people using the word resilience to tell you effectively that it's your problem and you just all need to person up and cope better, feel free to cope kind of thing. And that's not really what resilience should be about. You work in a job that sticks you at the extremes of human emotion and experience, and you don't come into the job on day one with all of the skills to be able to do that. We should be helping people to do that better. Thinking about your sleep is a form of resilience training, but it can only ever be part of a solution. And we have to remember that we have to look after you just as much as you have to look after yourselves and you have to look after patients. So resilience is only ever part of an overall solution when we think about these things. Within our trust, we are attempting over the last year and a half to put in place a campaign that reminds every single member of staff in our trust that breaks are there to protect our patients. And this is intended to give everybody the backup to feel supported, to say that if they're not getting the breaks, that we want to know about it, because we don't think we can deliver the standard of care that we aspire to as a trust. Our children's hospital, I'll be slightly smug for a second, was the first children's hospital in the UK to be rated as outstanding by the CQC. And part of that is because we have a culture that looks after our staff as well as looking after our patients. So this is trying to replicate that in our adult trust, which is more challenging, I have to admit. But it means we've put in a lot of work about trying to do that with our medical registrars. Those of you working the new contract, there are some really important points in the new contract. The new contract, for the first time, says that your working hours and conditions are inextricably linked to patient safety. If you are working a shift where you don't get the right amount of breaks, Mr. Hunt, when he was involved in negotiating the contract, tells you that you are not providing safe patient care. The contract gives you the ammunition to make that point. It also, going the wrong way. Slide missing. The contract is also much clearer about what constitutes breaks than previously. Other organisations have picked this up. I think there are a few anaesthetists in the room, so hopefully you will have seen the work that's been done by the anaesthetic colleges about this. They are coming fairly soon to start rating departments on their culture, attitudes and facilities towards this. And anaesthetic departments up and down the country are going to start getting red, amber and green ratings based on how well they do this. That's because one of those doctors, pardon me, from that very first slide, was an anaesthetist and happened to work in the deanery that current Royal College of Anaesthetists president is from. And both of the anaesthetic colleges have really put a lot of thinking and a lot of effort into trying to do this better. The Emergency Medicine College went with that "you are not a superhero," so you may have seen this popping up in EDs, this kind of idea that promoting the idea that even in busy environments, or especially in busy environments like emergency departments, we need to be challenging these attitudes. And the BMA joined the party towards the beginning of this year. It took them a while, but they produced a really nice document, package documents that pulled together a lot of the resources and evidence behind all of this. But it all boils down to this. All of this becomes academic. If you are regularly working shifts without taking breaks, that is the single most important thing that any trust can do to try and make this better, both for their patients but also for their staff. And if it is the regular experience of staff that they work without breaks, then think of those air traffic controllers. You go beyond 2 hours, your function and performance is dropping. So we should be thinking about this. If you want to know a bit more about sleep, there's a couple of general texts. So these are both non-medical books written about sleep. So Why We Sleep is great. The Sleep Revolution is written by Arianna Huffington, businesswoman, founded the Huffington Post. She had a nervous breakdown, largely due to sleep deprivation. As she recovered, she realised how important sleep was, not just to her, but also to her companies. And she's completely rewired all of her businesses to take into account sleep. But as I said, I have no magic. It is all about getting the basics right, thinking about all these things to try and optimize your sleep. And although I try very, very, very hard to win this argument, the CEO of Netflix is currently sitting on a rather large profit margin. So I suspect at the end of the day, he's probably beating me. Slightly over time, I apologise, but I think we started late. That's me. I'm more than happy to take questions if there are any. As I said, you can also get me on Twitter. If you do go on Twitter, the pinned tweet at the top of my timeline has a way to do this teaching in 30 minutes. So it's a way to build this into induction in local departments, and I'd encourage everybody to do that. It's basically a 15-minute video of me doing this talk. That 10-minute BBC programme plus that article that you've all got. And that's some of the key resources for this if you want any of them. Right, I need a drink now. Any questions? Stunned silence. Yes. I caught all of that up until the last sentence. Yeah. So as I kind of alluded to, it's something we're just beginning to understand. So over the last year, the research base for Alzheimer's risk being related to REM deprivation in particular is strengthening. We know that in acute settings, so if you look at your intensive care environments, if you optimize sleep in those environments, so you kind of make sure that daytime is bright and nighttime is dark, you try and optimize the ability of patients to get sleep in those units, your rates of confusion and delirium post-ICU admission decrease. So we think that the risk of dementia is related in the same way but on a longer scale. I think that is something that's going to increasingly become more apparent. You cannot derive information from individual cases, but both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were famed for their short sleep and both succumbed to dementia. Donald Trump, we know from his Twitter feed, gets very little sleep, and I would suggest is perhaps already showing signs of not being in his state of mind. So yes, I think optimizing sleep makes sense, but dementia, absolutely. Anybody else?
Just one statement, and I'm just doing night shifts for years. I agree that basically driving home after night shift, I'm driving from here to Brighton. Sometimes I just ask myself that I'm in Brighton and home from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, is that it's a relative risk, and most of the time, so you're on autopilot, you're doing it, but the thing is you're on autopilot. Kids who sleepwalk don't usually come to harm, but if somebody leaves a roller skate on the staircase, they slip and fall on that. They manage the staircase fine when they sleepwalk, but they can't cope with the unexpected, and you'll be the same when you drive. As long as everything is happening exactly as it should do, then you're probably going to be fine. You get one random little old lady, little man who's driving a bit weirdly on the motorway, and suddenly that's you. You don't have the ability to react and respond, and that's it. So most of the time you'll be fine, but your risk is high. And yet, getting to the other end and not remembering how you got there is a sign that you are not necessarily driving safely. Yep. So pain and sleep has an interesting bidirectional relationship. If you are sleep deprived, your pain threshold lowers. So you become more sensitive to pain stimuli when you're sleep deprived. So from that way around, improving sleep is often an important way to try and help manage pain in the long term. The difficulty is that obviously the converse is also true. If you have lots of pain that is causing disruption through the night, and the challenge with sleep is that in the daytime people might say, I'm sore, at nighttime they're asleep, and all you get is disrupted sleep quality, and they might not even wake up. So it's that you need to tackle both things at the same time. Amitriptyline can help. I'm afraid I'm not an adult physician, so we don't tend to give kids amitriptyline, but it can help. But it's about managing the whole picture. And as well as putting in good pain management strategies, it's worth looking at strategies to optimize the sleep. So if they happen to also be somebody whose response to being chronically in pain at the end of the day is to be on Netflix, for example, then they're amplifying their sleep disruption. So doing that piece of work about trying to think about things they can be doing to improve sleep alongside the pain management is probably well worth it. Yeah, absolutely. So an hour seems like a long time, and I never get enough time to say everything I want to. So individual variation, as I touched on, is a big thing with sleep. I work a lot with teenagers, so the median amount of time for sleep for a teenager is about 9.5 hours, but the range of normal is 7 to 11 hours. Teenagers all become night people. They all get their body clocks shifted so that they don't really want to fall asleep at 10 and it'll be 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock. If you're a teenager, and that can happen to further degrees, and you'll be 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. If you're a teenager with the bad genetic luck to have a body clock that shifts you to being a I fall asleep at 1 o'clock in the morning, and you're also an I need an 11-hour sleep person, then your life is rubbish, because there's no way to get 11 hours of sleep for any of us usually. And if you're already going to sleep late, then you get 6 hours of sleep. If you have 11, you're massively sleep deprived. So those individual variations are really important. Most people will know whether they're a morning lark or an evening owl. Hands up if you're a morning person. Hands up if you're an evening person. Hands up if you're neither. Yeah. So most people's body clocks do not sit at 24 hours. And most people have body clocks that run slightly longer, which makes people night people. But it can be shorter. A few people are right balanced in the middle, but not many. And yeah, that's difficult to shift. If you are a night person, you cope with working night shifts better than a morning person on average. That's the pros. The downside is that people who are genetically night people tend to die younger. So, we will get to the point where we can look at that in more detail quite soon from a genetic point of view, and it will impact things like driving insurance, because it has an impact on things like that. I was reading a paper this morning that says that actually you can see, so even though teenagers all shift, you can track circadian timing from a genetic level from quite early on all the way through the lifespan. The difficulty is that when you get wedged into jobs like medicine or nursing, that actually you get forced into becoming different types of people. And most people then adapt to that, but then there are consequences then of going against your own personal genetics. Any more, or are you done? Awesome. Thank you very much.